for the meeting? Okay, yeah, we're good to go. So go ahead and gavel us in.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I don't have any gavel, but it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to the Workers' Compensation Management and Labor Advisory Committee. I'm Patrick Priest, the chair, co-chair, and management representative. My first meeting, and I'm the chair. So I cut me some slack, I guess. And I think the first order of business is that Teresa will take a roll call.
Yes. And also, please bear with us too. This is our first committee meeting that we're running with Zoom. We're finally in the out of the dark ages of GoToMeeting. So okay, so I'll call through via caucus. Matt. Okay. Yeah. Jill.
Present.
Good morning. Marcy. Scott.
Here.
Okay. Good morning. And Margaret.
Morning.
You're right next to each other. Okay. Let's see. Tammy.
Here.
Yep. And Sarah.
Present.
Okay. John. Okay. And Lynn. See up in the corner.
Here.
And Chris Patrick's here. And I see Andrew on screen. So, okay. We have quorum.
Okay, so we have a quorum. So the first item on the agenda is introduction of committee members. I'll go ahead and start with myself. I'm new to a lot of you. I have met some people on the management side. I am Patrick Priest, the co-chair for the management side this year. And I am the executive director of CIS, which stands for City County Insurance Services. And I will... are we going to ask each person to introduce? There's a lot of new people. Should I have each person
Would you like me to call on them, or since I have the attendance?
I have a list here.
You do. Yes.
Yeah, I have the list here. So,
okay.
Yeah. So I will start with Matt Calzia.
Hi there, I'm Matt Calzia. I'm a nurse practice consultant with the Oregon Nurses Association and also a practicing nurse down in the Eugene Springfield area. He, him pronouns. I missed, what else are we including in our intros?
I think that's enough. I think it's just a brief introduction.
Thank you.
So thank you, Matt. Next is Jill Fullerton.
Good morning, Jill Fullerton, representing the Firefighters Union of Clackamas Fire, Local 1159.
All right, thank you. And Marcy Grail.
I don't see her on here yet.
Is she absent? Not here, okay. Scott Strickland.
Hello everyone, Scott Strickland, he, him pronouns. I'm Special Projects Counsel for IUE Local 701, heavy equipment and stationary engineer operators. Second time on MLAC here, so happy to be back and excited to dive into stuff.
Thank you, Scott. Margaret Weddle. I'm saying that right.
It's Margaret Weddle, that's fine. I am new to MLAC and I represented injured workers and recently retired from the Workers' Compensation Board.
Oh, thank you, Margaret. Tammy Bowers.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Tammy Bowers. I'm a former claims adjuster. I am now with the trucking company directing their workers' compensation nationwide. And I also am on MLAC. My terms are ending, so I will be off MLAC here in just a few months.
Thank you, Tammy. Sarah Duckwall.
Good morning, I'm Sarah Duckwall. I'm a management representative to MLAC, and this is my first term. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I believe John McKenzie was absent earlier. Has he joined in?
I do not see him on.
Don't see him. Okay. Lynn Mcnamara.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lynn McNamara. I preceded Patrick as the executive director of CIS and now am a consultant in the same field. And I've been a member of MLAC since 2015 and have 5 weeks to go.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Lynn. I guess everybody knows Andrew Stolfi. He's an ex officio member, I guess, of this, and he's on my list here. I don't think he needs no introduction. I don't think.
Thanks, Patrick, and good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Stolfi. I'm the Dcbs Director and State Insurance Commissioner. Pleasure to welcome you all, especially all the new faces to the committee. We've got a really great agenda today and a lot on our plate for this year. So really looking forward to working with everyone on this reconstituted and re-energized MLAC. I know we had a lot of training over the last couple of weeks and a lot of information shared, and I'm just really excited to work with all of you, and I know all my colleagues are as well on a lot of important things. And we do have, Patrick, if you don't mind, I saw one or two of our colleagues who will be doing a lot of work with you and the rest of the committee. If they can say hi real quick. There's Teresa, of course, that you know.
Of course.
Maybe Sally. I just saw Sally pop up, and if Kara's on as well.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Sally Cohen. I'm the administrator of the Workers' Compensation Division, and we are here to support the MLAC committee members. So you'll be hearing from us, and we are listening to you, and our job is to support you. Thank you.
And Andrew, you're correct. Kara is here. She's actually here in the conference room with me, hence why I'm wearing a mask.
Okay.
But yes.
And I saw Jennifer as well.
Morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Flood, Ombuds for Oregon Workers. I'm here as a resource and provide any kind of perspective from the workers' end of our workers' comp system. Thanks.
And David Waukee.
Morning, everybody. I'm David Waukee. I'm the Small Business Ombudsman, and I'm a advocate for employers. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess anyone else from DCBS want to say hi? All right. Well, we've got a big team, and I know we're really all excited to be as helpful as we can in any way that we can. So thanks for allowing us to say hello, and turn it back to you. Thanks, Patrick.
Okay, thank you very much. It is a great team, and I can attest that the training was great. I feel prepared and ready. You know, it's been a lot of meetings, and so we're ready to get down to business and actually have a meeting. And so the first order of business, and you did comment, there's a lot of new members, so it's a little bit of a tricky one, approving the minutes of the last meeting, because most of the people that are voting did not attend that meeting. And so I did do a little bit of research on the Robert's Rules of Order, and apparently it is perfectly acceptable to vote on minutes of meetings that you have not attended, and that I should be asking, are there any corrections to the minutes? So those that attended, do you have any corrections?
Yes, I had a few corrections. This is Tammy Bowers. I had a few corrections that I sent to Kara. So if Kara has made those corrections, then I approve those.
Tammy, she has made those corrections, yes.
Okay, then I'm ready to vote.
So I'll move the minutes of the April meeting.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those that approve say aye.
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 Any opposed, make the same, say nay, I guess. Okay, hearing none, it is approved. So there we go, our first thing done. Very exciting. All right, so moving on, we have department updates, and I will turn it back to Teresa.
Thank you, and I will be brief because I know we have a lot of people here to talk about LCs, so I will not drone on, I promise. So in the agenda, members, you have a hyperlink, and we printed out for you. It is the Workers' Compensation Division's forward-looking administrative rulemaking calendar, which is one of the great things that the division's rules coordinator does for all of us. I appreciate it greatly. The only forthcoming hearing coming up is on February 15th at 9 a.m. will be the public rule hearing for a set of rules that are revised annually. It's the Oregon Medical Fee Payment and medical services and managed care organizations. Again, it's a standard that the link also provides hyperlinks to the rule filings, any other pertinent information. But if you do, members or those in the audience have questions about the calendar, please feel to ask them to me and I will get those answered right away. The other two items are kind of related to Andrew's own remarks during our introductions. Part of the reset of MLAC included a new committee handbook for members. It's actually a public document. I will put it in chat shortly. So what it consists of is the committee's mission, the set of values that the committee members look at when evaluating issues in front of the committee, the set of operating rules. So for example, to refer to Patrick's motion, Roberts is what we use on that. And it also does additional things such as clarifying what actually constitutes a quorum and an affirmative vote, and examples of motions that can be taken there. All that. The last but certainly not least, we will be posting on the website shortly, if it's not there already, the tentative schedule for MLAC during the 2022 session for legislative review of these three concepts when they become bills and any other new measures that are going to be in front of you all. So that is it for me.
Okay, well, thank you, Teresa. The next item on the agenda is statutorily required reports, and our presenter is Justin Fuller, who I know was testing, so hopefully we got everything up and running. You're on mute, Justin. Oh, there you go.
Yeah. The unmute buttons on these different applications are all over the place. So good morning, members. My name is Justin Fuller. I am the senior economist at DCBS. I replaced Gary Helmer about a year and a half ago. I have worked at DCBS since about 2008, doing different kinds of research work and budget and policy work. So the materials we'll be presenting today have been uploaded to the MLAC website, so you should be able to find them there. I would note that on the WBF portion of this on page 8, there's a typo. If you printed out the slides we sent yesterday, it doesn't affect any of the numbers or any of the graphs. It's just a reminder for myself that never got deleted. It has been fixed since then, and it has been uploaded on the website. So apologies for that oversight. So Teresa, do we want to start with the PPD update?
Yep, I'll load it. I'm loading the slide deck. Oh, please.
Yeah, you can go to the next slide, please. So this is our 7th PPD update to this committee since 2007. It is a statutorily required report on trans and permanent partial disability. So this update provides that it meets that statutory requirement. Do we want to go to the next slide? And I'm just going to read over these first few slides pretty quickly because there's nothing super interesting on them. It is largely an explanation of the larger document that was sent out. There's no really new information in this presentation that isn't in that document. There's a significant amount of historical information in that document and some additional analysis. So a couple things just to note before we really get started. This update does focus on PPD awards under the new benefit system, which replaced the old version sometime in 2005 or so. And the reason we really focus on the new benefit systems is that over the last few years, less than 1% of the benefits paid are under the old system. And eventually that'll turn to zero. And like I said, the history of the legislative changes and the descriptions of the benefit structures are in the appendices of the longer document. I do like to start at the end of the presentation. So just the conclusion is that all the PPD trends that existed in our last update in 2019 are largely unchanged in 2021. The percent of claim resolutions with PPD continue to decrease. The average award for PPD claims continues to increase. And because of this, the total PPD costs paid out in the system are largely the same over the last few years. So we will, and if anyone has questions about any of this, please feel free to interrupt. Questions are almost always more interesting than what I have prepared. So I'd love to answer questions if you have them. But since I am relatively new in this role, there's a pretty good chance I will politely request some additional time to figure out an answer to your question and get back to you. So Teresa, please. We will start by talking about how often PPD awards occur relative to the number of total claim resolutions. I would ask you to please note that there are two axes on this graph. The one on the left, which is in just numbers, represents the number of claim resolutions in a given year. The right axis is the percentage axis. You read with the percent of resolutions with PPD and the percent of resolutions that are ended with a claims disposition agreement. So in 2020, there were about 21,000 claim resolutions, excuse me, thank you. This has been increasing slowly since about 2010, after falling rapidly from employment losses during the Great Recession. And then prior to that, you see an uptick in resolutions from 2005 through about 2006 from just the booming construction economy. If the number of PPD claims as a percentage of those total resolutions has continued to fall since prior to 2010, it has fallen pretty steadily and pretty quickly. There are, of the 21,000 or so resolutions, about 15% of them were awarded PPD awards. The other main trend is that the percentage of resolutions that are closed by a CDA has remained roughly the same since about 2009 or 2010. So the number of PPD claims continues to fall, both as a percentage of the total resolutions and as absolute numbers. Teresa, please. Thank you very much. We break this into awards that are awarded impairment only awards versus those that include some work disability awards. Again, two axes, so please be careful. The left axis is for impairment only claims, which is the blue line, and then the right axis is the work disability claims. Work disability claims are less than half of what they were in 2000. Let me find my note. Are less than half of what they were at their peak in 2009. Impairment only claims also continue to decline, but at a slower rate than work disability claims. So just the number of permanent PPD claims continues to fall, or not PPD claims, PPD awards continues to fall. So if we look at the total cost of these awards, Teresa, please. We can see that even though the number of claims continues to fall, that the total PPD awards have been static since about 2015 with some variation in 2017 or so. A couple different things shown on this graph. The lighter, warmer colors on the left for the earlier years, those are payments under the old benefit structure, which have since been replaced by benefits under the new benefit structure, which are the cooler blue bars. This graph also shows at what point in the PPD process the award was awarded. The vast majority of PPD awards are done simply when the insurer closes the claim and the award is given then. The next largest chunk, but it is a really, really small portion, is in the reconsideration process. And then finally, the smallest portion is after that when the disagreement over the PPD award goes to WCB. So, like I said, in 2020, less than 1% of total benefits were under the old benefit structure. And again, you can't even really see the old benefit structure on the graph anymore. In 2020, about 95% of all the PPD awards were given at the insurer closure, and the remaining 5% were either given out at the reconsideration stage or the WCB stage. So if claims are declining, but total costs are remaining the same, that means that the average cost per claim is increasing, which is shown on the next slide, please, Teresa. Okay. So this chart shows just the PPD award for PPD where there is no work disability. This is just claims where there is some kind of impairment. You can see that the average award has increased to $5,900 in 2020, which shows a pretty strong upward trend. What's driving that trend is these awards are pegged to the statewide average weekly wage, which has a strong tendency to increase over time. But when we look at work disability claims, which is on the next slide, please, we see a similar pattern of increased costs for each claim. You can see that even for the impairment portion, it's significant. The impairment portion of work disability claims is significantly larger than the cost for impairment-only claims. It's about double what it is for just when there's an impairment award, and then the work disability portion you can see is a significantly larger component of the average cost for these claims. So, just concluding, average cost per claim going up like it has for years, number of claims declining like they have for a number of years, which produces basically no change in the total PPD costs to the system. Questions on this?
Are there any questions for Mr. Fuller? I'll scan
yes,
in the participant
I've got
list.
one.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of correlation that you've found as to why there has been such a steady decrease in the PPD awards?
So it most likely has to do with the shifting industrial sectors of where Oregonians are employed. These tend to be really significant injuries, and as Oregon has moved away from manufacturing and timber into service industry jobs, there's less of an opportunity for these kind of injuries to occur. Plus, even within the same industry, the safety standards have improved, and so you get just fewer and fewer of these serious injuries just because people are moving to safer industries and the industries themselves are becoming safer.
Great, thank you very much. And I guess just for the record, this is Jill Fullerton that was asking that question.
Thank you, Jill. Good question. Any other questions? Well, hearing none, I think there is one more report to receive, right?
There is, Mr. Priest. It is on the status of the Workers' Benefit Fund. And thank you, Teresa, very much. So, again, this update meets the statutory requirement of updating MLAC on the financial status of the Workers' Benefit Fund through the end of fiscal year 2021. So, again, starting at the conclusion, at the end of September 30th, 2021, so you get an extra quarter, the fund balance of the Workers' Benefit Fund was over $150 million, which is about 26 months of expenditures. The statutory requirement is that the WBF needs to maintain a fund balance of at least 12 months. You can see the fund balance as the blue line, and then the orangish line is the statutory requirement of 12 months of expenditures. The vertical line is where this turns from actual expenditures and revenues into our projections. And you can see that we are expecting to spend more than we earn in assessment revenue over the next few years before we sort of, if we don't do anything, we'll end up below the statutory requirement somewhere in fiscal year 2026. The last time we updated this, that we were assuming a declining ending balance, but because of COVID and some other things, that slope has gotten steeper. So just going over some changes from fiscal year 2020, assessment revenue declined by 13% and expenditures grew by 9.5%. Please do note that the decline in assessment revenue isn't driven just by employment declines driven by COVID, but fiscal year 2020 actually included 3/4 of the 2.4 cents per hour assessment rate, but 2021 included nothing but the 2.2 cents per hour rate. And we will talk a little bit about why expenditures grew by 9.5% over what they were in 2020. So starting out with revenue, the next slide shows the history of what we've charged employers and employees to fund the WBF. It is currently at 2.2 cents per hour, which is the same as it was when it was created in 1996. It's been this way since 2020, and it's set to extend into 2022. As a point of reference, for each 0.2 cents that we change this rate, it gains or loses about $3 million in assessment income. So if we set the assessment rate in 2023 to 2.0 cents, we would lose about $3 million per year. And the same if we increased it back to 2.4, it would go back up to an additional $3 million. So that covers sort of the revenue side of things. In terms of expenditures, there haven't really been any changes since 2020 in the distribution of things, but the costs have gone up. Over half of the WBF expenditures of program expenditures go into the retroactive program. The reemployment assistance program accounts for another 43%, and then the reopen claims program less than 5%. And there are a few other really, really small programs that account for about 1.9% of total WBF program expenditures. In terms of dollars, the retro program spent about $38.7 million in fiscal year 2021 providing benefits to injured workers. The reemployment assistance program through various channels, there were about $31 million in expenditures, and the reopen claims program, it was about $2.5 million in expenditures. So we typically provide greater detail on the retro program and the reemployment assistance program, just to help folks understand what's driving these really large costs. And for the retro program, there's a couple offsetting things, just like there are for the PPD awards. There's this very, very long-term reduction in the number of claims that are paid retroactive benefits, and this decline is driven probably by exactly the same thing that are driving the declines in PPD, which is Oregon's industries are becoming safer and Oregonians are moving from, slight riskier jobs to less riskier jobs. And then the average payments, again, driven by a really similar process, are going up over time. And these are also determined by the average weekly wage. It's a little, there are more ups and downs with the retroactive program simply because there are so many different factors that go into determining how much each claim gets paid out of the retro program. One of the larger changes for the retro program is that we are, the rate of this decline in the number of claims has slowed down pretty significantly. And that may just, if you lose the downward pressure from the claims, the total cost could increase as a function of that. That being said, the distribution of claims by when the injury occurred still is really, really heavily weighted to relatively old claims. About 61% of the claims being paid out of the retro program have injury dates more than 33 years ago, which covers injuries back through 1990. And just these tend to be focused heavily, these payments are focused heavily on injuries where the worker was killed instead of permanently and totally disabled. We don't see that many permanently and totally disabled claims rolling through the retroactive program. So there should be attrition ongoing from this. Sorry, Teresa. There should be additional attrition just because of the age of the claims are so heavily weighted towards those older claims, but it looks like it's been slowing down. For reemployment assistance expenditures, the increase from 2020 to 2021 is due to increases in the employer at injury program. It looks like the preferred worker program costs are, inside the historical range of where they normally were. This is going to probably be driven by increases in the average weekly wage, as well as an increase in the wage subsidy starting in 2020. And this is, it's relatively high and just a relatively large change from fiscal year 2020. So the long-term liability of the Workers' Benefit Fund at the end of fiscal year 2021 is $847 million, which is about 5.5 times of its ending balance. This ratio is about the same historically. The total liability has been creeping up over the last several years, but it's inside the range of where we've had it before, and it looks like maybe just normal variation driven by how we calculate the liability and with additional claims information year after year. And then finally, just there are costs incurred in administering this fund. And we sort of bundle in payments to BOLI and OHS as part of this. So there were about $6.1 million of administrative expenditures in fiscal year 2021. So about 22% of that expenditure went to OHSU to do their research into workplace safety. The 3% went to BOLI, and this is largely to investigate retaliation claims when a worker applies for workers' compensation. And the remaining 75% is incurred by WCD, OIW, and WCB, the sort of administering workers' benefit fund processes. And that is the end of the WBF update. Do folks have questions on this?
Patrick or Chair, I have a question, if you don't mind.
Certainly, please. Yes, please.
Okay, Justin, so if we're looking at 2025 as kind of, the marker, do you recommend a readjustment at some point if the trends continue in the direction they're heading?
So we would be violating the statute at that point. There are, so I assume there would be discussions that would be handled to address that. And just, it's not only a violation of statute, it's probably, it puts a pretty significant risk just to maintain payments in the case of another recession or something like that. One of the things I would note is that a lot has changed in the last 2 years in really unexpected ways, and I would be unsurprised if there were additional really large changes in sort of the economic background of Oregon between now and that point.
Okay, so what would be your recommendation on when this readjustment needs to happen?
So that is I'm going to hedge and say that's a political question, and determined by the risk that DCBS management is willing to accept. And so it just generally speaking, the earlier we make changes in the assessment rates, the smaller those changes have to be. So I can't speak on behalf of anyone, but if this looks like a genuinely good forecast of where things are headed, that DCBS management, and again, I'm hedging, would want to look at that relatively early rather than waiting until fiscal year 2025 to make that change.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and my apologies for hedging like that. I don't want to speak for anyone who's in the position to make that actual decision.
No, I understand. I just, starting early and, looking at forecasts, and if we see the trend being accurate, would be beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Great
part
question.
of the decision to reduce rates in when did we reduce rates? We reduced rates in 2017, 2019, and 2020. The goal was to actually mediate the increase in the ending fund balance, and it just COVID happened on top of that, and that's what drove that downward trend really, really quickly.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, sir. And there's a hand raised. DCBS Management has raised their hand.
Yes, thank you. And just to Sarah's question and to this point, the WBF assessment is reviewed every year, and there's an opportunity to raise or lower it or keep it the same every single year. We're going to start that process in a couple months, I believe. Justin does a lot of research, and those graphs that you saw about where it's going to trend off and where we might get below 12%. We run multiple variations of that based on lots of different economic and other assumptions, and had talked about potentially raising the assessment for this year. Decided not to, based on the health of the fund and kind of the general economic situation, but do agree earlier action is better than later action. You can make smaller increases that or changes that could be more impactful and meaningful, but we'll definitely keep MLAC updated as we go through that exercise, and there are hearings and other opportunities for everyone to generally comment upon our recommended changes as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other questions? All right. I'm scanning through the list of participants. I see no other hands raised. So I think we are. Oh, wait, I see one more hand raised.
Yes, Scott.
Scott Strickland.
Yes. Sorry, I raised my physical hand, not my digital one there. For the record, Scott Strickland.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, would it be possible to maybe get the division to kind of correlate some of the data on decline to see maybe with OSHA data or something like that, if we could get information? I'm interested in this decline. I know we've talked or we've heard that it may be sector transition, it may be just safer workplace in general. If there's any way that we could get some of that data on the safety to see how that correlates, so we can see if there's any other factors that may be involved in that as well.
So, Mr. Strickland, we do have data on safety by industry, and we would be happy to share that.
All right. Good question. Another one. I guess I'll scan both ways, see if anybody's raising their hand in the images. I don't see any other questions. So I thank you very much for your two great reports. And I think it is time to move on to our next item on the agenda, which is the 2022 legislation review. The first item is LC 96, Firefighter Cancer Presumption. And I understand due to late changes, Teresa will be identifying the presenters who will be speaking.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually, first to be here to speak to the LC is Representative Graber, who is the concept's official sponsor. Good morning, Representative.
Good morning. Good morning, Administrator Van Winkle and members of the MLAC board. For the record, my name is Dacia Graber, and I am proudly the state representative for House District 35, Tigard and Southwest Portland. Thank you so much for the opportunity to introduce House Bill 4113, also known as LC 96, before you this morning. I know it's not every day you have legislators come before you to testify, but in this case, I'm not only a chief sponsor of this policy, I'm also a 22-year veteran of the fire service, still serving my community full-time when we are not physically in session. The legislation I bring forward to discuss today is an expansion of presumptive cancer coverage that builds upon the existing 2008 legislation. At that time, Oregon's cancer presumption, while limited in scope, was a first essential step in protecting the people who run in when everyone else runs away. You see, firefighting is one of the very few jobs where we don't have a choice of what we're exposed to or which dangers we may encounter. When our community calls on us, we're there. Regardless of the danger, we go. And despite knowing that we could encounter life-threatening conditions where we may not go home, we never turn away. It's a duty and commitment that every firefighter holds at their very core. That danger lurks long after the calls end, however. Despite the headlines about burnover and structural collapse and entrapment, it's actually cancer that is the #1 killer of firefighters per the CDC. Expanding our cancer presumption is a moral policy imperative. The two provisions I want to discuss today have particular urgency, but I am neither a lobbyist nor a lawyer, so I will leave it to my peers to take you on that deep dive, but here's my take. Bladder cancer is occurring with increasing frequency and in younger firefighters across the nation. 42 states in this nation recognize bladder cancer as a threat to their firefighters and address presumptive bladder coverage. Oregon is one of only 8 that do not. This matters. This is a workforce issue. Oregon is struggling to hire and retain firefighters, especially in contrast to neighboring states. In 2012, when I was hired by my current employer, I ended up with one of the 16 coveted academy slots out of over 3,000 applicants. This year, for 24 spots, we barely broke 300. I'm a realist. We're not going to change that overnight, but at the very least, I believe that we should care for our firefighters on equal footing with our neighbors. While the presumptive coverage varies state to state, every state bordering Oregon has bladder cancer coverage. This seems like a small concession that will make a huge impact for the life and family of a firefighter that may have to face this cancer. Regarding reproductive cancer, you may have noticed that I don't look like the other firefighters who are here virtually with me today presenting this bill. And I actually need to make a correction. While she's not presenting, I want to give a shout out to my firefighter sister, Jill Fullerton, because Jill and I are 2 out of only 276 female professional firefighters currently working in the entire state of Oregon. And while we are equal on the line and equal what we encounter and are exposed to, if one of my male colleagues contracts a reproductive cancer as a result of their job exposure, that cancer is covered. If Jill or I were to contract a gynecologic or reproductive cancer, currently we are not. This is a fundamental fairness issue. As Oregon strives for equity and representation in the fire service, including funding a groundbreaking apprenticeship program to bring more women to the service, we absolutely need to correct this fundamental disparity in coverage. It's time to walk the talk. I am proud to share this is a bipartisan, bicameral policy with 35 sponsors and more waiting to sign on. I want to express my gratitude to our partners in workers' compensation who our state's firefighters look to and count on to care for us in our greatest hour of need. I speak from personal experience as the wife of a firefighter cancer survivor. Did not expect this. Facing cancer is one of the most trying and traumatic experiences a firefighter and their family may face as a result of our job. Please don't forget the very human face of the heroes under the helmet. This is good policy. It is a small but meaningful step to expanding coverage to care for those who, without question or hesitation, show up time and again to care for our state. Thank you so much for this opportunity to bring House Bill 4113 before you for your consideration. I humbly ask for your yes vote in committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative. That was very moving, and I appreciate you taking the time for such a personal and powerful statement. This is my first time chairing this meeting. Do we call for discussion and questions after each presentation?
Yes.
We do. Okay. All right. Well, let's see. I will scan through and see if anybody's got their hand raised. I don't see any questions. I think we're all very moved, and I know we're going to talk a lot about other people will be bringing forward. Oh, I see. I just noticed. I see your counterpart, Jill Fullerton. Yes, please speak up.
Thank you, Dacia. That was awesome. Thank you for all the information. Do we have any information in regards to kind of where we compare with the reproductive cancer presumptions for females with other states as well? That was a great info that was provided with the bladder cancer. Do we have comparisons for the other?
So we do not have specific comparisons. What we are finding, my staffer actually just texted me and she said, I will get this to you. The women in the fire service, as you know, not a relatively new thing, but we still constitute less than 6% of the overall fire service. So many of these studies are just kind of starting on this, but we are seeing an increase in states that are allowing for this, that are covering the female reproductive cancers, because as I said, we're bringing more women to the service, we're bringing more, and we don't have that same coverage, and it is just a fundamental fairness issue and an equity issue. But we will get that information to you, Jill. Thank you.
All right, I see one more hand raised. I'm going to say it right this time. Margaret Waddell. Did I say it right?
Thank you. So I understand that Portland Fire and Rescue is not covered under the state workers' compensation system, but they do similar jobs in our society. Can you tell me if you know whether this would put, or how Portland Fire and Rescue members are treated with regard to the changes that you are suggesting?
My understanding is they would be included in those changes, but I feel like that is a question best answered by the lawyer who will be speaking on the bill, Mr. Nelson Hall, when it's his turn.
Okay. Good question. I will scan through again. The electronic hand raise pops right up to the top. So if you want to use that, I would appreciate it. I don't see any other hands raised. As a citizen of Tigard, I appreciate your representation. Oh, I see John McKenzie.
Yes, that was certainly a great presentation there. I just had a few questions on what are the cancer-causing agents, and is it a chronic exposure, or is it an acute exposure, or I don't know, just maybe a little bit of background on what is exposing the firefighters to this cancer?
Absolutely. So I'm not a scientist, and we'd be here all day if I were to go through every cancer, but it's the chemicals as a result of combustion that we are routinely exposed to, as well as diesel particulate in the day-to-day operations. There are, through studies with the FDI or NIOSH and CDC, have identified firefighter cancer-causing agents. Some states actually tie their presumption to those particular chemicals. Oregon took a different path. It's about half and half in the different states, and I'd be happy to share those with you. But where did you go in my Hollywood squares here? There you are. But yes, it is. Some of it is routine. Some of it is acute exposure. For most departments, these exposures are chronicled. We have run records and training records, and I believe, and again, not a lawyer, but every firefighter that is diagnosed with a worker's cancer that is presumptive goes through a review process. Some of those cancers are immediately covered by workers' compensation, and some have, like my husband, we had to fight to have that covered.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, John. There is a hand raised from Sam Hutchison.
Hello, I'm Sam Hutchison. I'm the Bureau Director for the City of Portland's Fire, Police, Disability, and Retirement Fund. So we are the group that covers the City of Portland firefighters for disability or the workers' compensation program. So the question is, does this bill cover FPDR, firefighters covered under the FPDR plan? Is yes, it is. The present firefighter cancer presumption is under ORS 6568025. And accompanying that, when it was passed, they did 6568026, which specifically says, well, not specifically, but it says large cities with their own plan are required to cover cancers. So yes, this just adds to the cancers in 6568025. So yes, they are covered.
Great, it's great to get that clarification. Let's see if we have any other. There are no electronic hands raised. And let me scan through my list one more time here. Oh, Tammy, there we go. Hi, Tammy. Thank you very much.
I have two questions. First of all, how do you raise your hand on this thing? I've been scanning all these little boxes, trying to figure that out.
It's under reactions at the bottom of my screen.
Okay.
There's a smiley face, and you click on that, okay. And then raise hand pops up. So
okay.
There you go.
All right. Thank you for that lesson. There, I officially did it. Sam Hutchinson, I have a question for you, please. Are you, as the City of Portland, supporting this LC 96?
Yes, we are supporting the LC 96. We've done some research on, when we heard this was coming through for female firefighter cancers, there have been limited studies done, and so some of the cancers, I don't have that list in front of me, so they've shown that I think cervical, ovarian, bladder, breast cancers are all predominantly done by women. The other ones on the list do not yet have studies that show that they are caused by firefighting. We've looked at some of the states. There's 2 Canadian provinces and 2 states that I've seen recently have added these to it. And again, the 2 Canadian provinces and one of the states have just done, I think, ovarian, cervical and breast, and I think bladder, but they've not done the others that are on this list. So my staff and I are wondering, is there studies out there showing that the other cancers on this list are actually covered by, related to higher incidences in female firefighters? That doesn't stop us from supporting the bill, but I think there are some questions to ask about it. And I think there's been some questions about maybe at some time in the future that we look at all types of cancers and really see other studies that support them, additional risk by firefighters for those cancers. So that's our thoughts on it.
Okay, thank you. I would like to know if there is medical studies that we could look at. It seems only fair that if testicular and prostate cancer are included, that the uterus, ovarian cancer, those should be included as well. That seems only fair. But I would like to see the medical studies for the bladder cancer. Is it possible to get actual documentation?
Thank you, Tammy, for the question, and thank you, Sam, for the support. I will let Nelson speak to that. We do have a handful of studies. I will be the first to tell you that the studies on firefighters are somewhat limited, although there are more on bladder cancer. I also want to note that breast cancer is covered under the existing cancer presumption. Thank you, 2008 legislation. It has been used many times in the state of Oregon already. But yes, there are studies on bladder cancer. There are initial studies on the female cancers right now, and they're just not complete because very few women are actually through their entire careers. We had our first female retiree 2 years ago after a full career in Oregon. So I believe there's an active study at University of Miami, and I know University of California, I get this wrong. One of the universities in San Francisco is also currently doing a peer-reviewed double-blind study.
Okay, great. Thank you. I would look forward to seeing that information. Just me personally, I know several people who have had bladder cancer, including my dad, who was an air traffic controller. None of them are firefighters. So I didn't know that it was linked medically, because it seems like it's just increased across the board. So I would like to see that, please.
We also have a 2019 study from the IAFF that shows a link to bladder cancer at firefighting, which we'll be happy to share. Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you, Tammy. Good question. And Representative, thank you again. I will do one last scan of everything to see if there's any last comments. I don't see any, but it was a very good discussion, and I really appreciate you bringing this forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And again, thanks to the members and Administrator Van Winkle for the opportunity. I know there are a few more folks here to speak on this, so I'll bow out.
Okay, thank you. All right, Ms. Van Winkle, I guess I'll ask you to call on the next person on our agenda.
Okay, we have representatives from the Oregon State Firefighters Council, but I'm not sure if Nelson is coming up, or Carl, or Jack. There's Carl.
It's gonna be Carl this time,
okay.
And then Nelson at the chair's discretion. Good morning, board and Administrator Van Winkle. For the record, my name is Carl Kettig, and I'm the president of the Oregon State Firefighters Council. The Oregon State Firefighters Council represents over 3,700 career firefighters and paramedics across the state of Oregon, and I'm here to accompany my colleague and fellow firefighter, Representative Graber, on LC 96 or House Bill 4113. House Bill 4113 would, as you heard, add gynecological cancers and bladder cancer to the list of presumptive cancers for our firefighters. Specifically, the bill would address cancers affecting reproductive organs, including the uterus, fallopian tubes, ovaries, cervix, vagina, and vulva. When we initially passed 656, the addition to 656-802, the Cancer Presumption, the statute addressed male reproductive cancers only, and this proposal brings protection parity for our approximately 276 female career firefighters in contracting occupational cancer. The recognition of the growing number of females in the career fire service is important. When we as a profession create a perceived double standard or cease to engage modernizing our standards in protecting any class of worker, we have all failed. House Bill 4113 modernizes that by inclusively adopting the same protections for our female members in the case of an occupational cancer diagnosis. This proposal is consistent with the MLAC mission and values as an important step in worker protections. To exclude occupational cancer experienced by women ignores the goal of diversity, equity, and inclusiveness in Oregon's career fire service. On bladder cancer, to the list of presumptive cancer is an evolution of occupational health and the fire service. While there are some who question the need for 43 or 4113 at all, we experience cancers more and more frequently as compared to other professions. Since adopting the original presumption in 2008, the fire service has increased participation in occupational health standards such as NFPA 1582. That's the standard for comprehensive medical program for fire departments. It's a very comprehensive physical. We've actually had to arbitrate it with employers to get it because it does start a process to evaluate firefighter health throughout their entire career. And it is now the norm, not the exception in Oregon. And we have all our partners, both our workers' compensation partners and our employers, to thank for making that so available to us statewide. We also need improvements in our fire protective gear. All the major players, the alphabet soup gang, as I often refer to them to, are working on increasing our protective element of our gear. And it's a tremendous challenge that they're going to continue to do. You heard that 42 of 50 states list bladder urinary tract cancers as part of their presumptive occupational cancers for firefighters. We just can't wait for improvements in gear. We have these cases happening every day. Our mission at the Oregon State Firefighters Council is to improve working conditions, safety, wages, retirement security, and hours through political action and legislative change. HB 4113 is about equal treatment of all firefighters and the applicability of bladder cancer in our current cancer presumption. We have 12 years of claims experience with occupational cancer coverage for firefighters here in Oregon. There's been, as the records show, there's been no measurable increase in mod rates, premiums, or the collapse of the workers' compensation program as a whole since enacting the 2008 law. 4113 ensures the equal treatment of our workforce and is supported through peer-reviewed scientific data and comparative claim data. This bill would bring Oregon in line with standards throughout the nation with no measurable increase in comp rates. This is an easy fix with a far-reaching impact. This bill is written includes those not covered under 656.802 as Sam indicated, and we certainly thank the board for consideration of 4113, and we urge a yes vote in committee. Thank you very much, and I'll be willing to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Koenig. Do we have any questions? I don't see any hands raised as of yet, at least electronically. Now let me do my visual scan. I passed Jill too quick. Did you have it? No? Okay. I don't.
I believe it's Lynn Mcnamara has her hand raised.
Has her hand
Mr.
up?
Chair.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. You're quicker on the scan. Lynn, please ask your question.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks for your testimony, Carl. I just want to echo Tammy in my interest in seeing the statistics and the comparative claim data that you mentioned at the end of your presentation. So that will be certainly helpful to me, and I'm sure all of us.
Okay, I don't have any problem with that at all. As indicated by the representative, the data, while the N number for female firefighters and reproductive cancers is low, just because we have a small N there as far as studies go. And the bladder cancer, we have stuff that is as late as 2021 showing some causation routes and exposure ties. So be more than happy to share that with the committee. And certainly from the standpoint of Nelson talking briefly about that, I will defer to him on specifically the case study stuff. I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all understand that given the limited number of female firefighters nationally as well as here, the data is not going to be as available for female firefighters. But anything that you can provide us is going to be helpful in thinking about this.
Yeah, we are more than ready to share that with the group in the interest of time. I don't think this turns into a science project, but certainly get you that information.
Okay, well, thank you for the question and the response. And I know we have other people that want to speak, but I will look and see. I found a new way to scan the images so I can do it more quickly. I don't see any other hands raised.
Actually,
but I thank you very
John
much,
has-
Mr. Oh, we do have one.
Yeah, mine was
Is
right
there-
along the lines of Lynn, and it would take more time. I geek out on the data, so I would like to see the data locally, first national numbers in terms of the cases in the case study, but also too a part of my field, and I'm a safety manager for a large general contractor, is on the prevention side. And Carl, I know you touched on that a little bit. I'd be interested to see some, what are you guys doing? Because we know silica, asbestos, and lead, all really bad stuff. So for years, the industry has been working to fix that. So I'd be interested more, maybe offline or whatever, to hear what you guys know that this is a cancer-causing agent. What are you guys doing to prevent that, to help prevent that? Because once you get cancer, it's already too late. So what are we doing up front to help that? So
thanks for the question, Mr. Chair, John. I think really looking at our comprehensive medical plan, NFPA 1582, that's really our guidebook for starting your career. I know I'm a retired firefighter after 30 years of service. In 1996, we started doing physicals on me, although I started my career in 1989. So these 1582 physicals on hire and then every year after that really are a big piece of our preventative stuff. I will tell you, gear, our turnout gear has, I will say morphed, but progressed in a manner that has more coverage. Of course, our skin being our number one absorption rate. We have diesel particulate exhaust removal systems. I mean, there's a very long list, but I would be more than happy to send our occupational testing 1582 to you, or actually the whole board, to say this is where we start. And frankly, our comp carriers and our employers also have a huge piece of that prevention talk. So we talk about one specifically, our hoods that we wear underneath our helmets, and then making sure our gear is clean. So you'll hear folks in the fire service talk about how often they clean their gear, which is a cultural change. When I started, you wanted the dirtiest gear to show everybody that you worked, and now really it's 180 degrees from that now, where look, the peer pressure and cultural expectations along with company expectations are you keep your gear clean, and obviously a second pair of gear makes a huge, the ability to do that, and the proper extractors and what have you. But there is more information on prevention. Also, the IFF is a huge player in the prevention world also. So along with the Oregon Fire Chiefs, and like I said, our comp carriers, is very important. It's a team effort, really. So, but thanks. I hope I answered at least part of what you asked.
No, great job. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the question and response. Any other questions before we ask Ms. Van Winkle to call our next speaker? I don't see any.
I do not. I forgot.
Lisa,
I was going to say, Carl, did Nelson want to present as well before we move on to the next panel?
I think so. Yeah. So he's got a very brief,
Okay.
very brief, as I understand. For Nelson, it's super brief. So yes.
If the committee is ready, I'm ready.
Yep, we're ready.
We are ready, Mr. Hall.
All right, and I take it that you can hear me and see me, at least hear me. Thank you. Co-chairs, members of MLAC, like the other presenters, I thank you for taking the time to hear me. And anytime I start with an introduction, including my credentials, if you will, I resist, because it sounds like anyone, I'm bragging, and I don't mean to do that. But by way of introduction of myself to those who do not know me, my name is Nelson Hall. I'm an attorney with an office in Portland. I have been representing workers, specifically firefighters, for over 36 years. And was involved with the writing and passage through MLAC of the Cancer Presumption in 2009, as well as other presumptions involving firefighters and first responders. I also, for those who do not know me, served on the Oregon Workers' Compensation Board 1993 to 1998, and chaired the Workers' Compensation Board for 2 years. And again, I offer that not as bragging, but just to try to put my testimony and my presentation in with some credentials, my bona fides, if you will. I am appearing today, as others have already indicated, as counsel to the Oregon State Firefighters Council. And I'm happy to answer questions when I finish here. My purpose really is to touch on the technical side and probably the rationale, reasoning, scientific side of this legislation. Obviously, back to my credentials, I am not a physician. I'm not an oncologist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an epidemiologist. So I do not pretend to be able to quote chapter and verse in terms of the scientific studies. though in response to a couple of the questions that I've heard so far, asking for data and so on, I can start right now by telling you, yes, there is evidence-based reasoning for including bladder and the female reproductive cancers in this presumption. Technically, this is not a change to the presumption itself. That is, the burdens of proof and the eligibility for the presumption. This bill does not touch that. It's not an attempt to change the presumption itself. It is quite simply an effort to include two types of cancer to the list of cancers that are already included in this presumption. So my point in making that is where you are not being asked to go back and revisit the need for a presumption or the policies behind a presumption in general. That was debated and decided effective in 2009. The next point I'd like to make is that I respectfully submit, and again, I'm not avoiding the questions and the interest in the underlying science. However, I think I respectfully point out that MLAC is not being asked today, specifically with this piece of legislation, is not being asked to resolve a scientific debate over statistics and over risk analysis and whether how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, so to speak. This, I respectfully submit, is a policy recommendation. You are recommending, and when you heard the request, that MLAC unanimously approve or support this piece of legislation, you are making a recommendation decision here. And your recommendation will then be passed along to the Oregon legislature and to the governor. And so again, I'm emphasizing this point because really today's discussion about House Bill 4113 is policy as opposed to science. And I say that again with all respect to the request for the underlying science, which is there. This is evidence-based, and I strongly urge that consideration because here's an example. And an example is just that, it is one example. But there is evidence to support including the bladder cancer. The GU cancers, of course, have been addressed, and I'm not going to repeat that in terms of where the science is. But in terms of including bladder cancer, I think a perfect example is found in the workers' compensation claim for career firefighter, Salem career firefighter, Jeff Zaluski. And firefighter Zaluski has allowed me to refer to his claim. That claim for bladder cancer was made with the city of Salem and its administrator. And the city of Salem had firefighter Zaluski's bladder cancer claim reviewed by an independent medical examiner. That medical examiner did a thorough literature search. And part of his IME report back to the city of Salem included that scientific literature search and summaries of the pertinent scientific literature. And based upon that IME report, which I'm going to quote one line from here in a second, the city of Salem did the right thing. They stepped up and accepted firefighter Zaluski's bladder cancer claim as compensable, as covered by Oregon workers' compensation. And they did so based upon this IME opinion that indeed firefighter Zaluski's exposures over his career were the major cause, not just a cause, but the major cause of his bladder cancer. And I want to quote just this one sentence from that IME report that says, prolonged exposure to benzene compounds found in burning debris is associated with bladder cancer risk. So it is not surprising that studies have shown that firefighters are twice as likely to have bladder cancer than the general population. Now, going from the science, which can be debated all day long, I want to move quickly to more of the policy consideration for this committee. and I can hear or would anticipate some pushback relative to the 42 other states that include bladder cancer in their presumptions. And that pushback might be, well, the fact that other states does not answer the question of whether Oregon should. And quite frankly, I love Oregon's motto. Oregon, she does fly by her own wings. But when we look to other 42 states, that should tell us something about the underlying foundation for why Oregon should include bladder cancer in its presumption. It's a little hard for me to tell a Portland firefighter or any firefighter, and I do represent firefighters all across the state of Oregon, it's a little hard for me to tell them, you know, if you were a mile and a half further north over the Columbia River, your bladder cancer would be included. Or over the Snake River into Idaho or the Smith River in California, guess what? Yeah, your bladder cancers would be included, but they're not yet on the Oregon list. So Oregon, make your own decision. Absolutely, she flies by her own wings, but there are 42 other states that give us reason for why bladder cancer should be included. The next is Mother Nature. You know, this is where, and again, I don't come at this as a scientist or as an oncologist, but almost kind of from common sense. We realize that under the current presumption, we have basically the tract, the human anatomical tract, we have mouth, throat cancer covered. We also have stomach cancer covered. We have colon cancer covered. We have rectal cancer, colon rectal cancer covered. So Mother Nature is probably scratching her head and saying, wait a minute, what, you can go on down that system and then skip the bladder and then continue on down the system? So as a matter of Mother Nature, it doesn't make sense to leave bladder out of that systemic following of carcinogens from the mouth down through the passage of the human body. Also Mother Nature, when it comes to the female reproductive cancers, let's face it, the exposures for female firefighters and male firefighters are the same. And so when we're talking about human anatomy, Mother Nature again is saying, are you kidding me? What, you're going to include testicular cancer, but in the same area of the human anatomy, we're not going to also cover the female reproductive cancers. So there's some, I think Mother Nature is asking us to be consistent, and House Bill 4113 is doing that same thing. It's like, let's be consistent. Let's include bladder cancer as part of that anatomical chain, and let's include female reproductive cancers for all of the reasons that it should be included. I am impressed by the fact that there is bipartisan support for HB 4113. Both House and Senate, as I understand, there is bipartisan support for this, which is my way of appealing to the bipartisan nature of MLAC, asking management to join labor in supporting a unanimous recommendation over to the Oregon legislature. I want to touch quickly then on the chemicals, because I know that's been asked a time or two, and I apologize, I don't know the new members of MLAC well enough by full name and so on, but there was a question about what chemicals, and again, literature can be provided, but specifically for bladder cancer, and I'm looking at the documents from the International Association of Firefighters, but for bladder cancer, arsenic, diesel exhaust, there is that's what's loaded with benzene, and then the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, right? And that, according to the literature I'm looking at, that's a group of over 100 chemicals found during the incomplete burning of oils and gases and other combustibles. So to answer the question earlier, yes, the exposures are there, and yes, there are specific carcinogens to which firefighters are exposed, and which do contribute to bladder cancer and female reproductive cancers. The question about whether this applies to the city of Portland and its firefighters has already been answered. Yes, it does. And so at this point, I'm sorry, Carl, you said I was going to be short, and I apologize to the committee. I went a little bit longer than I thought I was going to, but I just want to say from a policy point of view, there's every reason to include bladder and female reproductive cancers in this presumption. There's science behind it, there's policy behind it, there's Mother Nature behind it, there are 42 other states behind it. And quite frankly, I think to those who might want to push back and resist, those who may be opposed to this, I think, members of the committee, the question really needs to be turned. Instead of asking, why should these two cancers be included? The question really should be, why should these two cancers not be included? Thank you very much for hearing me out, and I also stand ready to answer questions within my limitations.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Hall, and I will scan through to see if there are any hands raised. I don't, oh, I see Tammy. Tammy, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Nelson. Thanks for coming again. Is there, hi. Is there any reason why these two cancers were not included in the original firefighters presumption, though?
You know, Tammy, I thought that someone might ask that question, and so my response comes with a bit of a smile on my face. I do not, I think we all know the old saying about watching legislation being made. It's like watching sausage being made, and once you watch it, you don't want to eat it, right? So it really, I think, to answer your question without being flippant about it, Tammy, it really goes back to negotiating. It goes back to compromising. It goes back to old-fashioned, and if you were in the MLAC meetings during that time, or if you were off into the wings where I and others would turn and would go off into the corner and debate and so on, then we'd come back to MLAC with some compromise. So that's a long-winded way of saying bladder was not included, female reproductive cancers were not included, simply because they were not part of that ultimate compromise in 2009.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that question and response. Any others? Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much. I think, Ms. Van Winkle, we're ready to move to our next presenter.
And before I go on to, we still have 6 people signed up for this concept, and we have 2 others. So for those that are here for LC 56 or LC 38, we may not be able to get to this today. So I think we'll actually, with your indulgence, Mr. Chair, if we can stop at 11:30, we can talk about if we want to go longer or next steps there. Okay.
We will definitely do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
So next I have Andy Graham from the Special Districts Association of Oregon.
Hey, Teresa, I think I'm going to start and then
okay.
The rest of our panel.
Okay.
Sorry. Hi, good afternoon or morning, members of the MLAC committee. My name is Hasina Wittenberg, and I'm here today on behalf of 2 organizations, the Special Districts Association of Oregon and the Oregon Fire District Directors Association. With me on my virtual panel that doesn't exist in my office is Andy Graham and Dr. Noel Weiss, a medical doctor who received his degree from Stanford and his PhD from Harvard in epidemiology and biostatistics. He's on the faculty of UW, so go Huskies, and part of the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. Dr. Weiss is an epidemiologist who studies the validity of science and will speak more to the studies and the science that have been brought up today. I know that my colleague Carl doesn't want this to become a science project, but when MLAC develops policy and recommends it, as Nelson referred to, we hope that in developing policy that evidence-based reasoning will take place. Our membership includes 900 special districts. About 60% of those districts get workers' compensation coverage through our self-insured pool. We have 200 rural fire protection districts in our comp plan, and the Oregon Fire District Directors Association represents approximately 800 elected board members throughout the state of Oregon. There are 3 presumptions in statute, heart, lung, PTSD, acute stress disorder, for those of you who have been on the committee for at least the last 3-4 years, and then the 12 cancers that were put into the statute in 2009. In 2007, it was a massive, huge battle. I'm sure Nelson would agree with me. Adding these cancers to as a presumption in statute, and the proponents very narrowly lost that fight at the legislative level. Following sort of an ugly 2007, there was an interim negotiation, as Nelson referred to, and that negotiation was not necessarily entirely based on science. We ended up with, I guess you could call it deal a meal, 12 cancers presumed. There was negotiation on both sides. Bladder was discussed. I was part of that negotiation. It was basically Nelson Hall, me, Carl's predecessor, Bob Livingston, and Andy Graham's predecessor, George Goodman, and we just sat and worked it out because we didn't want to have another fight. And I think that is something I'd like to stress to MLAC, is that this was all negotiated. And so this is now being opened up again, and not part of a negotiation. Since the last go around with cancer, which has never been contemplated in a court session, over a decade has passed, the science has evolved, and the way the presumption has been interpreted by the Workers' Compensation Board has basically rendered the presumption functionally irrebuttable, and Mr. Graham will touch on that. But really, back to the science, there is essentially no new science that demonstrates that a presumption for bladder or reproductive cancers is warranted. Our compensation system is a model in the nation for other states, so comparing to 42 other states hasn't necessarily been a motivating factor for management to evaluate statutory changes. I suppose that if we were going to look for a motivating factor on our end, we could be motivated to have a full examination of the science that's evolved over the last decade with this statute, and also the heart-lung statute, because there are several cancers that could arguably be removed based on the new science. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Weiss, who will talk further about the medical literature review that he has given us that has allowed us to reach this conclusion. So Dr. Weiss.
Sure. Thank you. So I'm Noah Weiss, and as was stated, I'm from Seattle, working at both the University of Washington and the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center for now quite a number of years. In her presentation, Ms. Graber asserted that bladder cancer and cancers of the female reproductive tract could be, quote, the result of our job as firefighters, end quote. And that's exactly the question that the Special Districts Association of Oregon asked me to address. And the way I did it would be the way that well, an epidemiologist would. And it's the appropriate examination of studies of cancer incidence and cancer mortality among firefighters. Those studies have been conducted in a number of places around the world, a number of U.S. cities, some states such as Florida, in the country of Australia, and a number of Scandinavian countries. They've been facilitated by the ability to identify firefighters and then track them in terms of the subsequent incidence of cancer and subsequent deaths from cancer. These studies have been done. There have been, they've been steadily accruing over the years. These studies get published, and inevitably, the results differ a little bit from study to study for different kinds of cancer. And so people have engaged in what are called meta-analyses. They're basically averaging. They take an average of the results of these various studies and try to come up with a synthesis. The first one of these syntheses took place in 2006, and there have been several others, and the most recent is 2020. For bladder cancer, these syntheses, these averages, have estimated about, both in 2006 and in 2020, about a 20% increase incidence of bladder cancer, which sounds like maybe it could well be that firefighters do have an increased risk. But the results of these meta-analyses have to be taken with a grain of salt, because not every one of the component studies actually displayed data on bladder cancer. All of these studies they identified bladder cancers, but bladder cancer isn't the most common. Some of the studies are a little bit on the small side. And in about a third of the studies, there was a decision made by the authors in their publication not to present the data. what we've learned as epidemiologists, when that happens, when those data are omitted, they tend to be omitted when there's no association, or they're very small numbers. And therefore, the overall assessment of a 20% increase is likely to be biased upwards for that reason. And so my own preference in trying to get at this question is to look at those very large studies, both in the US, which covered 3 separate fire departments in 3 different cities of the country, large cities, or the Scandinavian study, which covered firefighters in 5 countries, and see what they learned. And it turned out that in both those studies, they observed not a 20% increase, but a 10% increase. Well, that's still an increase. The problem is, with the epidemiologic studies, we don't have a good ability to distinguish between a small increase of that magnitude as being a cause of the disease or just chance, or due to what we would call confounding. That is, it may well be that there are characteristics of firefighters that differ from the general population that could be responsible for that relatively small difference. Indeed, if you go back to the 2006 meta-analysis that was conducted by the National Institute of Safety and Health, they found a 20% difference, but yet they termed that difference, they interpreted it as being, quote, unlikely, end quote, to represent a cause of bladder cancer. I think that's kind of the way I would sum up the existing data for what seems more plausibly a 10% increase. That yes, it could represent cause, but it's not enough evidence in my mind to suggest that. Indeed, if you look at textbooks of cancer epidemiology and bladder cancer, you will not find an assertion that firefighting is a cause of bladder cancer. Mr. Hall referred to an IME opinion not too long ago that cited a doubling of bladder cancer incidence in firefighters relative to the general population. I would argue that that figure is completely incorrect. That is not the proper evidence to evaluate this question. Let me speak briefly to the issue of female reproductive cancers. Everybody's commented that the data here are much more limited than for bladder cancer. However, there are 2 studies that have reported on this, one in Australia, one in the state of Florida. In both studies, they found not an increased risk of cancer of the female reproductive tract, but actually a modest decrease in both studies. Now, nobody would argue that firefighters, female fighters truly are protected against these kinds of cancers by virtue of their firefighting. Again, it's the limitation of the epidemiologic studies when there's a modest association that it's hard for us to generate a causal or protective conclusion. But I think it's safe to say that based on those results, there is very unlikely to be a true causal relationship between firefighting and the development of one of these female reproductive cancers. The question was asked, I think it was by Mr. Paul, well, why shouldn't these cancers, bladder and female reproductive tract cancers, be included along with the other cancers? And I would argue that if it's the scientific data that are relevant, that's a good reason, because they should not be included because the science wouldn't support it. If there are other reasons that I can't comment on, I'm a scientist, but based on the epidemiologic evidence, there wouldn't be support for such action. With that, I'll stop.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the presentation and the information. I'd ask for questions. I see John has
Patrick, if I could just Patrick, could I just
sure, of course.
Andy Graham, who is the equivalent of Nelson Hall on our end, actually is signed up.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, let's finish the full presentation. Thank you for interrupting me.
Sorry, thank you.
Excuse me, Mr. Graham, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chair Priest. I wasn't sure if the committee wanted to take questions from Dr. Weiss first, so I hadn't jumped in initially, but members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here this morning. For the record, my name is Andy Graham. I'm an attorney with the law firm Cummins, Goodman, Denley, and Vickers. appearing today on behalf of Special Districts Association of Oregon and the Oregon Fire Districts Directors Association. The purpose of workers' compensation is to compensate workers for injuries or illnesses that are caused by work. Looking at any change in compensability standard, and particularly whether a presumption is appropriate, should start with that purpose clearly in mind. The problem with the newly proposed presumption, or the addition of these cancers to the existing presumption, is that it really, when you look at the science, it doesn't fulfill that purpose. The science, as Dr. Weiss touched on, doesn't reliably establish a causal link between firefighting and the cancers at issue. So the effect of the presumption then would be to broadly grant benefits to a certain class of workers for conditions that aren't established, in fact, to be work-related. To understand why this is, I think it's helpful to understand or to look at the compensability standards at work and what the presumption would do to change how causation is analyzed. In occupational disease claims, and that's conditions for which the condition arises over a period of time, the general rule, the law is that it's the worker's burden to establish that work was a major contributing cause of the condition. Mr. Hall touched on this a little bit in discussing the bladder cancer case that he had apparently with the city of Salem. Major contributing cause here means more than 50%. The cancer presumption changes that in major ways. First of all, causation of covered cancers is presumed. And what that means is that the burden is shifted to the employer to establish that the condition is not work-related. But the way that the presumption shifts that burden, it's not just that the employer needs to show that work wasn't the major contributing cause. Rather, the employer has to show under 656-8025 that the condition was not caused, quote unquote, in material part by work. And that has particular meanings that the board has interpreted over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. So in the cases the board has considered, and there have been 7 of them over the last 12 years, I think the board has looked at, the board's construed in material part to include even, quote unquote, extremely minor contributors. So, if work was even an extremely minor contributor, the employer can't rebut the presumption of compensability. What's more, the employers in defending these cases have to rebut the presumption through what's called clear and convincing evidence, which is a heightened evidentiary standard as compared with what we deal with in run-of-the-mill workers' compensation cases. That standard is preponderance of the evidence. So what we've seen in the existing cancer presumption, and it's been around now for 12, going on 13 years, is that although the presumption in theory is rebuttable, nothing in the statute says that it's not rebuttable, for instance, in practice, it's not. I alluded to this before, but since the cancer presumption was passed, there have been 7 cases that have gone to the board on a worker's appeal of an employer's denial of the cancer claim. And that denial was set aside in every one of those 7 cases. So in none of the cases that have gone to the board has the board agreed that the employer has satisfied its extremely high burden to establish that work was not even an extremely minor contributor to the cancer at issue. Mr. Hall suggested in his testimony that you're not being asked to resolve the question of causation. And in light of the way the presumption works, I submit to you that that's not really true. As our experience with the existing presumptively compensable cancers show, the presumption is in effect irrebuttable. It's in effect, it's conclusive. So if the presumption can't realistically be rebutted, what's wrong with that in the context of considering bladder cancer and the female reproductive cancers at issue in the bill that you're looking at? What's wrong with it is that if the medical evidence for the establishment of the presumption in the first place isn't really there, as Dr. Weiss has testified to, or if it's weak at best, the presumption results in benefits being awarded to workers for conditions that in reality simply are not work-related. And that's precisely what would happen with the passage of LC 96. As Dr. Weiss has said, and I'd invite you to read his report as well. Researchers from the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, concluded that bladder cancer, for example, is unlikely to be causally related to firefighting work. Mr. Hall read from an IME report from a particular case he had, but it's noteworthy that the doctor who authored that report isn't here today, and no one can question him about this evidence that he had for the twofold increase that Dr. Weiss, who is here today, says has essentially no basis in the medical literature. But if we consider the medical evidence generously, as Dr. Weiss has suggested, this 10% increase that might be there means that 1 out of 10 firefighter bladder cancers may have some relationship with work. But that means that 9 out of the 10 don't. With a presumption, 9 out of the 10 times, the presumption would be wrong. And 9 out of the 10 times, workers would get benefits for conditions that aren't actually work-related because the presumption can't realistically be rebutted. The evidence, as Dr. Weiss suggested, is even weaker for the female reproductive cancers. Because the cancer presumption expansion would lead to granting of workers' compensation benefits for conditions that aren't work-related, and because that's not the purpose of workers' compensation law, Special Districts Association of Oregon and the Oregon Fire Districts Directors Association would respectfully ask MLAC not to support this legislative concept. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Graham. We now have 4 comments waiting in the wings. I will let John McKenzie go first.
Oh, yes, thank you. Certainly hearing both sides of the argument here in such a high pressing issue, we don't have the data in front of us, so I feel like we're really flying blind on this. But it seems like if we are currently covering areas of the body, and I'm not an epidemiologist to know every single area of the body, but kidneys, testicular cancer, things like that, and different other parts of the body, why would that area be skipped over? So if you're covering the male reproductive area, why wouldn't you cover the female area as well? And if you're already covering the kidneys, why wouldn't we cover the bladder? Is this really a cost issue, or is the science really driving this? And like I said, we don't have the science in front of us to know what it is, but I just feel like there's a deeper issue here and it feels like it's being driven by money more than it's being driven by what's really best for the worker. So I have a lot of concerns, for sure.
I think different cancers are caused by different agents and have different risk factors, and I think Dr. Weiss would be best to speak to those issues. Doctor?
There's no question that the causes of the cancers can differ from one place to another. I would argue, this may not be a popular sentiment, that a number of the cancers that were included in 2008 as to fall under the presumption did not have a strong scientific basis either. I suspect there were other factors involved in picking those cancers. It sounded from the description that was given, there was a big of a political give and take. So that's the only thing I can say from an epidemiologic point of view.
Chair Priest, if I could just respond to that. It's not about money or people. Presumption is a very serious thing. It's changing this burden of proof, and there are very few of them in the statute, and they have been put in the statute after a lot of contemplation and a lot of discussion. And so when we did institute the cancer presumption statute, there was a give and a take, and this is more giving.
Thank you. Thank you for the question and the comments. I will take Matt Calzia's question next.
Thank you. First for Dr. Weiss, you stated that you did, you looked at studies from 3 different departments from 3 different cities. What was the sample size in there? And then did you have any like inclusion criteria?
Right. I can't tell you the details. These were I didn't myself do the study. It was a study. One of the areas, one of the fire departments was in San Francisco. One was in Philadelphia. I've forgotten what the third one was right now. But these are large samples. They went back quite a number of years to identify the firefighters with follow-up of 40 or 50 years of assembled cancer incidence and cancer mortality. So they're pretty big studies.
Okay, and then for Mr. Graham, you had cited a NIOSH report, and I missed what year that was.
The NIOSH, it's not a NIOSH report. It's, as I understand it, and Dr. Weiss, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the LeMaster study from 2006, and this is something that's discussed some in Dr. Weiss's written report that accompanies our testimony. The LeMaster study was, I don't know if it was commissioned by NIOSH or there were NIOSH researchers involved or something like that, but it's that study, as I understand it, that reflects a conclusion that it's unlikely bladder cancer was, that the numbers the study saw implied a causal relationship between bladder cancer and firefighting. That sort of relationship is unlikely.
Okay. And then, and I'm sorry, I'll try to wrap it up quickly. You also, Dr. Weiss, you cited a study of female firefighters in Florida. Do you have a sample size of that?
I don't recall. Florida has a lot of firefighters, but again, I don't know how many female firefighters. But the data suggest, again, I don't take this seriously as being truly protective. They suggest a halving of risk of gynecologic cancer among those women compared to Florida women in general. And I think that's very likely due to other differences between firefighters and other women with respect to risk factors for these various malignancies.
Okay. I do request that we get a copy of your report to go over. And then the other, my final question is, from a medical standpoint, do we base all of our decisions simply on when we have causation proved, or do we also use correlation to come to conclusions on diagnoses and treatment when we look at the body of evidence before us? Or do we only make determinations based on when there is statistically proven causation? When it comes to treating and diagnosing, when a doctor uses, say, their differential diagnosis process, and they are looking at and doing a literature review to help them determine how to use the differential diagnosis process, do they only use studies that prove causation, or will they use studies that also demonstrate that there's a correlative factor?
It's kind of a complex question. There is more and more over the years since I've been a physician, there's more and more emphasis on what's called evidence-based medicine. Now, the evidence can take different forms. Sometimes it could be randomized studies. Sometimes it could be what we call cohort studies, like the Firefighter studies. But in general, it's always people feel it's best to base all treatment and preventive practices on the scientific evidence that's available. Sometimes that evidence is imperfect, but you're always looking to the evidence as much as you can.
Thank you.
Are you done now, Matt? Is that some great questions?
Yes, thank you. I'm done with my questions. I appreciate the time.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for the questions and the answers. I'll go next to Tammy Bowers.
Thank you, Patrick. Hi, Dr. Weiss. I would like to ask a question of you, what you were talking about in regard to the bladder cancer. I want to make sure that I'm understanding your testimony correctly. I was trying to take notes as you were speaking. You did say, I think, that there is a 20% increase in bladder cancers. And then you were also talking about this 10% increase with firefighters. So are you saying that in the public sector, there's a 20% increase in bladder cancers, but in the firefighter sector, it's only a 10%? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm sorry. Sorry I didn't make it clear. the figure of 20% comes from these averaging studies of all the various firefighter studies that have reported on bladder cancer occurrence. One in 2006, another in 2020. The problem with those averaging studies is they don't include all of the studies that were done. Some of the studies simply didn't report the data on bladder cancer, even though they had those data. And we've learned over the years that this can lead to a bias upward in the estimate. So 20% is probably too high a figure. And that's why I relied on studies that were large studies in different continents, the two studies, one in Europe, one in the US, that reported on all the cancers. And in those studies, they came up with exactly the same figure, a 10% increase. But my point was that even a 10% increase is difficult to interpret because there are a lot of other reasons other than cause and effect that you can find a difference of that relatively small magnitude.
Okay, so there's, I'm unmuted. All right. So there's maybe 10 to 20% increase in bladder cancers in firefighters. Do you have that same percentage for just the public sector?
I'm not sure what you mean by the public sector.
Non-firefighters, you, me.
Right, I'm sorry. So the way to interpret this 10%, which is the figure I think is more trustworthy, is a comparison of the firefighter rate compared to that of the general population. And it's 10% higher than the general population. The actual incidence of bladder cancer in the general population or the firefighters is really very small, 10 or something per 100,000 per year. But that figure of 10% incorporates the general population rate.
Oh, so it's 10% just across everybody.
It's 10% higher in the firefighters than it is in the general population.
Oh, okay, I understand now. Thank you so much. Thanks for bearing with me to explain it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tammy. I had that question too, so thank you for asking it. I will go next to Scott Strickland.
Thank you, Chair. Scott Strickland, for the record. I guess I'm a little puzzled on the focus on the statistics and the data, which I'm definitely going to dig through this some more because I've heard some questionable claims about the way that statistics work with diagnoses and other things like that from Mr. Graham, I believe. But kind of trying to recenter this discussion and the conversation on the common set of values that MLAC members are observing everything through. A lot with, what member John McKenzie said, really interested in that comment of how does this advance balance and fairness? If we're dealing with reproductive cancers of one and not the other gender, why are we not discussing this as a balance and fairness issue? Or how does a survey of studies focus in on that common set of values? Adequacy of benefits, the same kind of question dealing with why are there other urinary tract cancers covered and not bladder? Affordability, the issue of cost impact on this. If there are so few female firefighters, would there really be a considerable cost impact even if it was presumed? And how does that weigh against the balance and fairness and adequacy of benefits? Efficiency, stability, and flexibility, that there may be other reasons to agree on this, as it sounds like it's admitted that a lot of these cancers are covered because this was part of the political process and what was made. But to what extent can we claim that covering one set and not the other would support these values, aside from just a survey of what little scientific evidence there appears to be on this?
Mr. Strickland, I would go back to the purpose of workers' compensation law in general being to compensate workers who have been injured or have developed an illness as a result of their employment on the job. There might be other policy considerations with respect to providing benefits more generally, but the workers' compensation system is designed to provide benefits to injured workers, basically. And I think MLAC's function, in part at least, is to evaluate whether proposed legislation serves that overarching purpose of the whole system. And if the medical evidence, if the statistical evidence doesn't establish a reliable causal link between firefighting work and the development of cancers, and if, as history has shown, the existing presumption is functionally irrebuttable, the result is that you wind up granting benefits to folks for conditions that in reality aren't work-related. And, you know, regardless of the overarching, you know, general policy of that, from a workers' compensation standpoint, that's not what workers' compensation is intended to do. If you look at this, if you look at the purpose and policy of the statute as a whole.
Right. I think my question was specifically about MLAC, given that those are the agreed upon common set of values that we're approaching issues from. I understand from a workers' compensation perspective alone, but you know, we have these values in our handbook and on the website, and that these are sort of the core ideas of what MLAC was created for.
Well, very, very good comment. I will. We have one more hand raised, but Teresa, you did ask to stop and pause at 11:30, and it is 11:30.
Yes, it is.
And so, this is my first time. Do we need to take a vote to continue? Do
no,
we recess? No.
I guess it's up to the committee because again, we don't want to be. We're very. For me as administrator, I'm very cognizant of the members' time first. If you can stay longer or not. What we can do is, clearly we're not going to be able to get to the other two concepts. We will carry those over to next week. We'll work with the co-chairs on the agenda and how it's laid out. We also will have those first. If we do run out of time for the witness panel here, I will make sure that the witness list in its order will be retained and go from there.
Yeah, I'm hearing a request to find out if everybody's willing to stay on and listen to more testimony today. Is there anyone that?
Okay, Priest. Can we just ask how much more on LC 96 is left?
From my list,
I think I would defer
we have
to the administrator.
3 more witnesses.
And Teresa, Nelson Hall, I don't mean to interrupt. Is your list of witnesses include coming back to me to allow me just 1 minute to respond to what has been?
No, this is just the list of people who requested to speak on this concept.
Yeah, your comment would come next, right?
Yeah, for the record, I would like to just address for a minute when appropriate. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So that was Sarah Duckwall. You asked that question, right? About do you have a time limitation to how much time you have left today?
My thought would be to finish LC 96, if that's amenable to the team group.
Okay. And
I'm seeing thumbs up and nodding.
I think there's one sort of request
I
to
agree
end
with
at
that
noon
too.
to accommodate member schedules because I have had a couple of those put into chat. So I will stop.
End by noon?
If the panel, I think we're done with the SDO panel, correct? Okay.
We have one remaining comment for them.
Okay.
One question for them from Nelson Hall. And we'll let him. He said he needed 1 minute to ask a question. I don't know if it requires a response or not.
If I could just make one additional comment just to clarify something that was said earlier, I think that I missed. Someone mentioned something about kidney cancer, and kidney cancer is not, in fact, covered in the existing presumption.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Mr. Hall.
Thank you again, all. I just want to briefly respond to a couple of the points being made by the Special Districts panel. Keeping in mind that you are not being asked to revisit the presumption itself. That's in response to Mr. Graham in terms of the impact of any presumption. And this notion of causation, which goes to the scientific literature as well. under the presumption, as Mr. Graham has indicated, causation is defined in terms of this contribution. So where the scientific literature may be trying to draw conclusions, is the science strong enough to draw a cause and effect relationship? That's actually not the question to be asked under this presumption, but rather, is there science that there has been a meaningful contribution? I so respect Dr. Weiss, and by no means am I going to try to debate the science with him. It would be silly for me to do that, but I do respect that he said, you know what, when you look at these studies, including the meta-analyses that are these averages, I think I heard him say you take these with a grain of salt. And I so respect that, because otherwise, as he would, I think, agree, the scientists, epidemiologists are trying to compare apples to oranges, this study, what factors were looked at, and so on. So my point is, I urge the committee to not base its policy recommendations on just what is the state of the science, which is always fluctuating and always subject to debate, including the grain of salt. Last but not least, in terms of the literature, which you will be provided, I'm looking at that IME report, and specifically a couple studies I just want to cite that the doctor cited, the IME did. This one is in 2021 published. The author is LaRoche, L-A-R-O-C-H-E, and it's published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. I'm just going to quote this one line here in the abstract, which is, the results consistently reported a significant increase in the incidence of rectal, prostate, bladder, and testicular cancers, as well as mesothelioma and malignant melanoma in firefighters compared to the general population. And then another one real quick is, the author is J-A-L-I-L-I-A-N, first initial H, and that's published in the International Journal of Cancer 2019. And again, the quote is, we found significantly elevated SIREs for cancer of the colon, rectum, prostate, testes, and bladder. So if the committee is looking for scientific justification to include these two additional cancers, I believe, I respectfully submit that the science is there sufficient to justify including these two cancers, while maybe not sufficient to answer the ultimate timeless debate over the science, over the epidemiology. Thank you again for hearing me out.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. I did get a request. We do have limited time that will limit questions in the rest of this meeting to committee members, and have any further questions from stakeholders move to the next meeting. And I do see Jill Fullerton, a committee member, has her hand raised. So I'll turn it to her.
Thank you, Chair Priest. Yeah, I'm wanting to kind of parrot along what Mr. Strickland was mentioning, that I am also wanting to really kind of come at this with a pretty with fairness in the forefront of our minds. And I'm definitely going to try to keep my MLAC labor hat on here. But yeah, with our values of MLAC being in the forefront of our mind, I'm just really wanting to, look at the fairness that some of the females in the line of firefighting deserve. And I guess due to that small sample size that even is available, I'd be more interested in getting some of those studies listed if they're available, and just out of any curiosity, is there any financial connection, I guess, between Dr. Weiss and SDAO with his some of his comments, or that's it?
Thank you, Chair Priest. MLAC member Fullerton. Yes, we did pay him to do a review. I don't know how much we paid him or what he charged. We just asked him to do a review of the literature without any predetermined outcome, and he wrote his report. There was not one word changed to it, and it was attached to our testimony.
Thank you for that. Was a very good question, and I appreciate the personal interest you have in it. So thank you for speaking up. Any other questions for this group from the committee? All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Weiss, Ms. Wittenberg, and Mr. Graham. It generated a lot of comments, so thank you for bringing that forward. Administrator Van Winkle, who's next?
Yes,
who do we have next?
Yeah, before I go next with this, I wanted to point out in chat there is a written exhibit from Hasina and Andy on that, and that will be uploaded to the MLAC website after the meeting. So with that, I will call up Jessica Giantino Villatoro. Thank you for your patience with the committee today.
Everyone, Justin Villatoro with the Oregon AFL-CIO. The Oregon AFL-CIO represents 300,000 workers across the state and is a voice for all workers throughout the legislative process. Happy to be here with you all today, and welcome to the new members. We're excited to work with you. I'm here today to talk about LC 38 or House Bill 4086, which I think all of you have access to. I'll make it brief because I know we don't have a lot of time. LC 4038 is really just an effort to modernize our comp statutes to really reflect the way that workers and employers are interacting throughout the state today. Lots of these statutes have not been updated for decades, and lots of things have evolved in the way that Oregon's working families and employers interact. So first, I'll just, the bill really does four things. That's what you'll see throughout the bill change is it changes the way that we view family when an injured worker dies on the job. We know that family structures look different than they do when these comp statutes were first envisioned. So what we want to make sure is, one, that spouses, we recognize spouses when we're thinking about giving families benefits after a worker dies on the job in the way that they live out today. Current statute requires a good chunk of them who have been married and cohabitated together within the state for 1 year and had a child as the result of that relationship. We know that that is not the way that all families are structured today. So what we did at the request, thanks to Holly O'Dell from SAFE, is tie that portion of the statute to family law statutes, because we know that that case law has evolved to reflect the way that families exist today in Oregon. The other change that you'll find to families as it relates to dependents, when we are talking about folks who are going to receive the benefit after an injured worker dies and they were dependent upon the injured worker, you'll notice the addition of blood and affinity, and that has a whole host of case law tied to it, and it is also the way that we talk about families when Oregon passed the Paid Family and Medical Leave Act a couple years ago. So really those changes are just to ensure that when a worker dies on the job, their families aren't left without benefits because of an arcane way that we currently define them. The next change that you'll find in the statute is related to a pretty also arcane term and pretty offensive term of invalid. So these are folks who are severely disabled and they receive a different type of benefit when a worker dies on the job because they would have been reliant upon that worker for longer than, say, a dependent that could go out into the world, graduate college, and be economically stable on their own. So we just changed the word invalid to incapacitated, and that's really to just not be offensive to folks who live with that level of disability. And then the next change that you will find is removing the director's discretion to reduce payments to family members after workers died on the job that live abroad. I don't think anyone at the agency has done this recently, but the fact that this is in our statute is pretty problematic, that we would reduce a payment to someone's family solely because they live in another country. I think lots of folks would find that racist and offensive. So we will just, the way that this bill approaches that is removes the ability for the director to make that decision. And then the last change that you'll find is related to the discrimination protections that obviously are also the trigger for any subsequent retaliation if a worker were to face discrimination as the result of a comp claim. So That change is just to get closer to aligning with the way that we talk about employment protections in every other facet of the law. And that says that any person acting on the behalf of an employer, so that is one change, that prevents someone from filing a comp claim or dissuades them from filing a comp claim. And those are the changes that we make in this bill. Happy to answer any questions. And I just do want to thank both OBI and SAFE for working with us on this policy.
Before we begin, I need to apologize.
Thank you for that.
Yep, I need to apologize to the audience that because there was some confusion. I inadvertently did not mention that we were temporarily shifting topics to LC 38, and we needed to do that to accommodate the bill proponent, Jessica's time as the bill proponent. What we can do, since we do have 2 more witnesses for LC 96 members, is that if you have any questions for Jessica, you can please send them to me. I can coordinate with Jess, and she can provide the feedback at next week's meeting, if that's okay. Is that okay, Jess? Okay. Okay. And so for the other witnesses for 38, we will. Yeah, I have you down. You'll be first when our meeting takes up on that topic. Okay. So with that, back to LC 96. We have Dave Berenberg from SAFE, and he also has a written exhibit that we will put in chat. David, are you there?
I'm there. Yes, I'm there, but I just turned on my camera. First, Dave Berenberg, Government Affairs Director at SAFE. Thank you for the opportunity to appear as a small square on your screen. First question, I'm just a little confused. Are we still providing testimony on the Cancer Presumption bill?
Yes, we are back to 96.
Okay, so for that we have Holly Odell, who is our legal vice president from SAFE. So you don't want me testifying on this, you want her. So I will, with the chair's permission, go to Holly.
Good afternoon, members. Morning still. It's morning. We have a hard stop at noon, right? Good morning, members of MLAC, co-chairs. Nice to meet all of the new members. I am Holly Odell. As David said, I'm a vice president of legal services at SAFE Corporation. My background is as a public health nurse, and then as a workers' comp attorney focused on the health of the workers' compensation system as a whole. And wanted to comment briefly about presumption and the firefighters presumption that's proposed today, specifically around what presumptions mean in Oregon. So as a default, for all workers covered by workers' comp in all industries and all professions, cancer can, when it's caused by one's workplace, be a work-related condition that's covered under workers' comp. And that's our default, and that's probably the case that Mr. Nelson Hall was describing. So any worker, including firefighters, can file a claim for cancer, and the carrier does a detailed investigation, learns about the specific exposures in the workplace for that particular worker, compares it to off-the-job exposures or off-the-job causal factors that might contribute to the condition, here cancer, and then provides an opinion about the major cause of that particular worker's cancer. And often the workers attending physicians are also involved in weighing in on causation. So a presumption overlays on top of and replaces that case-by-case analysis. So instead of seeking to understand what happened with a particular worker, what were their workplace exposures, what are their off-the-job exposures or contributing factors, instead we replace that with a blanket decision that inserts a conclusion into the system that the worker's cancer is work-related. So that's the presumption, right? We presume, understand, import
pretend that in that particular case, we're certain that that worker's cancer is work-related. And presumptions are sometimes appropriate. And they're most appropriate in SAFE's understanding when the condition is occupationally related as a general rule. So there's some conditions that are significantly associated with work. And I heard the word correlated today. So some conditions, some cancers are so significantly correlated with a particular job that they're deemed to be work related. Oh, I'll shut the door. Hold on. Certainly important, but I don't know what the dogs are so excited about. So when there's a significant correlation between someone's occupation, an entire occupation, and an entire body of conditions like cancer, then that might be an appropriate time to have a presumption. And that would replace the case-by-case analysis and understanding with this blanket conclusion that the condition, the cancer, is work-related. And so there might be two approaches to thinking about how to go about this. And I've heard today conversations about science, conversations about policy. Certainly would submit that maybe science and policy are designed to go hand in hand, and maybe science informs policy and sometimes is driven by it. And so there might be two reasons or approaches to doing policy and looking at science, right? So one approach might be, okay, we're going to look at the science and we're going to determine as an MLAC recommendation to the legislature whether we think these cancers are scientifically likely to be caused by firefighting to the extent that we want to replace this case-by-case analysis and presume or understand or import that all of these cancers of these types are caused by firefighting and firefighters. You might be looking for a significant scientific correlation if that's what you were setting out to do, because you'd be replacing that medical analysis of the doctors in the worker's specific case with this blanket presumption that lays on top of the system. You might want to become scientists, and you might want to look at the evidence and dig into correlation and look at the likelihood of these cancers in the general population, the likelihood of these cancers in firefighters. Alternatively, you certainly have the ability to make a policy recommendation that says that, we don't want to decide if this cancer, if this condition is work-related. We don't need to say that this condition is caused by work. We don't need to prove that this condition is caused by work. Instead, we're going to have workers' comp pay for it for whatever fill-in-the-blank policy reason. And that's something that you can recommend. That's within your authority to do. We suggest that would be very, very, very rare because all workers are deserved of strong protections. We all want workers to have their conditions and their treatments paid for. But on the other hand, workers' comp is designed for a very, very limited purpose. Overall, it's intended to compensate workers for work-related injuries and illnesses at the expense of the employer. So it might be very rare, but you might do it in certain instances. This question about female reproductive cancers, it may be a little bit different than regular presumption conversations. You might not be looking at, is there a strong correlation or a weak correlation? It might be that there's very little evidence. I know Ms. Fullerton, you were commenting on that. It might be that there's very little evidence one way or the other because we don't have very many female firefighters, and that's a policy issue that we want to have more female firefighters, and someday we only hope to have enough evidence to know whether there's a strong correlation, right? So that might be one of those very rare policy-related times where you decide that workers' comp should pay, even though you aren't going to determine that it's a work-related condition. On something like bladder cancer or other new cancers, you might be interested in whether there's scientific evidence that's strong that these cancers are so prevalent in firefighters compared to the general population that they should be paid for by workers' comp. Or you might leave in place the case-by-case analysis where every worker has the opportunity to have their medicine and history reviewed in light of their particular illness and their firefighting exposure. Like Hasina testified to, presumptions are very different in different states, and they're serious. In Oregon, it's a very serious presumption. They're different in all the other states that we've talked about. I know in Washington, I looked up Washington this morning, and even though they have a bladder cancer presumption, if it turns out that the cancer is more likely than not related to tobacco, physical fitness, weight, lifestyle, hereditary factors, or other non-employment exposure, then the carrier moves into that conversation of what was the more likely cause of the cancer. That's not the case in Oregon, so it has a different seriousness to it. So in sum, the health of the system is important to SAFE. It is important to SAFE that we are data-driven in making our policy and that we seek to be informed and understand what we're doing. On the other hand, we also understand that there's policy considerations in very rare instances that would cause you to weight other values or equities to make a different decision, especially in cases such as the women's reproductive cancers, where the evidence really doesn't provide clarity for us one way or the other. So I think that's what I have to share, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Odell. Any questions from the committee members? I think we're trying to make time for the last. There's one more person to testify.
Yes, there's one more, right? Scott Winkles.
Scott Winkles. Okay, Scott, you have 4 minutes. It looks like.
Good morning, Patrick, members of MLAC. I will be direct and concise in my statements owing to the time. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. Again, Scott Winkles representing the League of Oregon Cities for the record. After listening to the testimony, the questions, and the dialogue on that has occurred today, League of Oregon Cities does not at this time offer any objection to the inclusion of the reproductive cancers in the legislation. We have recognized that there is an equity parity issue at play here. We appreciate that it is a difficult concept to study and provide a scientific nature, but the equity and parity issue does rise to the forefront in that case. We do have a concern with the inclusion of bladder cancer in this legislation. We've heard today that there is conflicting scientific evidence at play. We believe that this should be a data-driven conversation. We would also note that there was testimony offered today that we've heard that a bladder cancer case was paid by the employer under the current statutory framework. That does appear to be working. We will also note that while bladder cancer is covered in multiple other states, those presumptions are structured quite differently. For instance, in Idaho, that presumption has a 12-year tail on it, so it only applies to 12 years after separation. And you've heard that the Washington case, tobacco use is considered very differently. We would respectfully suggest that this conversation be kicked to a work group. This February session may not give us, the MLAC or the legislature, sufficient time to analyze this to the degree that it deserves. And with that, I will yield my time.
Thank you, Scott, so much. Any questions? This being my first time, Teresa, can he come back? Can anybody come back to the next meeting and offer more testimony since they had less time?
Yes, that is correct. But it got also, again, time pending. So I would guess that individuals who have not testified for, once have the first crack at testifying, if you will. Then yes, second round.
Okay. All right. But it's a very important topic. I did get a message from a committee member, Lynn Mcnamara, that wanted to make a comment, and so I would let her take the seconds that we have left to make it.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Since we're not talking about LC 56 today, and we understand that parties, last MLAC left this issue, the parties were going to work together over the summer and come to some conclusion to bring to MLAC. We understand that the parties have met, but their minds have not met yet. So if the parties could meet over the next week before we see them again, I know at least for me and probably Tammy, that would be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. And Tammy, you've got your hand raised as well.
Okay, I'm wondering what's next in regard to LC 96. Are the two, is management going to caucus and then labor caucus and then at our next meeting? Or what do we do now?
That sounds like it seems very incomplete, and there's lots of testimony. I think we do need to meet on it as caucuses. I mean, this makes sense logically. This is my first time here. You're the expert, but I think we should and bring it back. I defer to the administrator to guide what the next steps are for our next meeting.
I would presume that was going to happen, and if the caucuses have specific information that you would like, for example, a specific individual. I mean, I know that happens all the time, that the caucus reaches out directly to a stakeholder for follow-up. If there's also any information that you want the department to provide, so for example, WCD is forthcoming or working on their bill analysis, so that will likely be entered into the record next week. But if there's other items that you want to see if the department has any information on, you can reach out to me and we can take care of that and put that into the record next week as well.
Thank you for that. Any other comments from anyone else before we end this particular meeting, adjourn the meeting? We'll see none. I guess, do I need a motion to adjourn or do I just adjourn the meeting?
I think, okay, I do have one more item just to make sure for those that are listening to the hearing after we adjourn. During the meeting, Representative Graber put in 2 items into the chat. That will be entered verbatim into the meeting minutes. So that's how we're going to retain that information. And now, Mr. Butcher, you can adjourn.
Okay. I hereby adjourn the meeting, and it'll be a good one next week. So very, very thoughtful. I appreciate the comments.